Welcome to Chats at Arcadia. I'm Dan,
And I'm Mike.
and each week we explore topics that have recently captured our attention, and will hopefully capture yours too. Let's dive in.
Okay, Dan, it's been a while. I have a question for you. What is the worst joke you have ever heard?
The worst joke. Okay, it's hard to think of a singular joke on the spot that, makes me cringe, but I'm just going to say the broad category of lazy puns. I think when people don't put much thought into pun and just say, oh, this word sounds like that word. And
Come on, puns are great.
they can be great, but
I've been telling everyone a pun I came up with.
okay, let's hear it.
Okay. The other day I converted a PDF file. It is now a religious text. You didn't like that? That was a brilliant pun.
Sure, okay.
Alright, do you have an example of a pun you didn't like?
Yeah, I can't think. I try to discard those from my memory if I can. Okay, well let's hear your worst joke.
Okay, my worst joke isn't truly a pun. So I heard this when I was in church as a kid, and it stuck with me because it was so bad. So the context is, this is the kind of church where, it's pews and hymns and there's stained glass windows depicting, saints and people from the Bible. And the pastor is telling us, he's making the joke and he's giving an illustration, but also telling a joke. And, he says, a young boy and his mother go into church, and the mother says, do you know what a saint is? And the boy looks around at all the stained glass windows and he says, a saint is someone through whom the light shines. Okay, now, he pauses for effect and then it's just silence. I think he was expecting people to laugh at that.
I mean, it works.
I guess there is a double meaning there, but I just can't imagine a kid saying whom, and it just, I don't know, it's kind of forced.
Yeah, I think we're coming to a similar kind of thought in that if a joke is forced, it's automatically kind of unfunny. Yeah.
Well, that leads into our first topic today, Daniel. We're going to talk about communication. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Right. Communication. Well, I sometimes read things.
Right.
And I read all sorts of different kinds of documents or PR statements, financial statements, technical documentation, things of that nature in my professional work. And I think when I was quite new and quite green up to things, I probably just had this idea in my head that there's so many words and I'm having trouble understanding it all. Maybe my reading comprehension is just really bad. But yeah, maybe I'm still open to that being a possibility. But as time has gone on and I've become more familiar with what these things are often saying, I think I've come to the conclusion now that no, the people who wrote these documents are often just really bad communicators.
Right, what makes them so bad?
Well, I think the problem is that people often write in a way that probably makes sense to themselves, but not in a way that other people could understand. To give you an example, so I work in data, and one of the most basic fundamental resources you would use as a data person is something called a SQL or SQL warehouse.
Right.
Are you familiar with that term?
I have no idea.
So if you read some sort of training documentation or learning resource, it'll probably give you a definition something like this. A SQL warehouse is often referred to as a data warehouse, is a centralized repository that stores large volumes of structured data from various sources. It is designed to support query and analysis, enabling organizations to make data-driven decisions.
Okay.
So that's the official definition of what a SQL warehouse might be. Now, for me, reading that out to you, do you have any sense of what a SQL warehouse actually is?
No, I actually have no idea. I know it stores data in a way, but I don't really know what that means.
So if you ask me what a SQL warehouse is, right?
Yeah.
I'd probably give you an answer something like, well, companies will often store data in things like spreadsheets, right?
Right.
Now, spreadsheets are a useful tool. They're a very flexible tool, but they're very limited. In the world of computers, there often is a trade-off between flexibility and efficiency or performance, right?
Right.
So Excel is definitely on the more flexible side of that spectrum, but it struggles with large volumes of data. So what if you basically took something like an Excel spreadsheet, but can perform with millions, if not billions, of rows of data, something that an Excel spreadsheet could not handle? So we put that kind of information in a very structured way inside what we call a SQL warehouse. Think of that as a different kind of filing system that's more efficient.
Right. So it's like a bigger, more efficient spreadsheet.
Exactly. Except you lose the flexibility of being able to click on individual cells and do particular things, but you have to use a different system called SQL, which is a querying language, kind of like a programming language, to say, hey, I want this kind of information from you. Can you grab it for me?
Right. So it's like a big spreadsheet, except less flexible, and you can access data in the spreadsheet by making specific requests in a computer language.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. So what was the difference here? The person who wrote that original definition used the correct terminology. They wrote things that make sense. Like from someone who has a background in data work, that definition makes complete sense to them.
I see, yeah.
But to a person who may not be familiar with those terms, it means it's absolute gibberish, right?
Yes.
It has no, despite it being from a learning material, it doesn't bother to consider the audience being completely unfamiliar with these terms.
Yeah, I see. And I can see what you did is that you took something I knew, like a spreadsheet, and then you said how it relates to a spreadsheet.
Yeah, so building knowledge on pre-existing knowledge, right? That's often a helpful tool to try to communicate, I think.
Right, I see. That makes a lot of sense.
And the reason why I communicate this way, actually, for me, I had a big paradigm shift when I learned about this German philosopher called Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Right, what a fantastic name.
Wittgenstein, in his early work, he came up with this idea called the picture theory of language.
Right.
And the way the picture theory of language works is quite fascinating. And he postulated that all of our thoughts are really just images in our mind, right? So when I think of the word SQL warehouse, I'm not thinking of a vague, abstract concept. I actually have a picture of what a SQL warehouse looks like in my head.
Okay.
And the point of communication or language is really I'm trying to create that exact same picture in someone else's head, in your head. So how do I do that? I need to use your paint. I can't use my own paintbrush in my head. I have to use words that you would understand, building on knowledge that you already have that I don't. That's not necessarily my pre-existing knowledge, right?
Right.
So I think that's changed the way that I have approached communication. It's more thinking about the audience rather than myself.
Right. So when you're communicating, you're always teaching in a way. Or
well, it doesn't even have to be teaching. Like, let's say we take a lot of so we have this idea of corporate speak, and like we understand that corporate speak is basically a bunch of BS that doesn't mean anything, right? I despise that because basically you're saying a bunch of words that don't mean anything. You might as well not say anything at all.
I see, yes. And we often use weird language in business. I saw a comedian sort of making fun of this. And, he was renaming movies to make them more corporate. And he said, when Harry reached out to Sally, and there are a few other ones, but that one that one interested me. We don't reach out to friend. Like, we reach out as a, it's a corporate word, corporate phrase.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only time I'd reach out to someone is if it's like someone whom I haven't talked to in a very long time. But yeah, I wouldn't often say, "Hey, I'm just reaching out to you as a friend." Like that, that seems a bit odd.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the thing is, I think the problem is, as I said, like with communication, I try to be more audience based. And this more selfish idea of communication, of basically trying to say the correct words, I think it actually stems from the way we've been taught to write in schools.
I see, right. So the teacher is marking you based on getting it right.
Yeah, I mean, so before I learned about this picture theory of language idea, whenever I wrote something, it was me trying to, not necessarily writing my own thoughts, but I was trying to write the right thing. Like whatever would get me the right, good mark, or whatever would get the approval. And as a result, what ends up happening, what used to happen for me is I used to write very verbosely and use big words just for the sake of using big words. And ultimately, the idea is try to make myself sound smarter.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when writing is sort of an academic activity, it's kind of, you're showing it off. And I guess that makes sense if you think, oh, I'm writing a thing that's to show off how good I am or how smart I am. But I had an experience where, in a tutorial when I was at uni, and the tutor said, good writing makes the reader feel smart. And it sort of blew my mind to think, like, oh yeah, that's exactly right. That's why I like the authors that I like. Because, they make me feel like I'm smart, rather than just showing off. Or like them. It's not my favorite writers, even like non-fiction writers, aren't the people that I think are really smart, but they're the people that make me feel smart. And that's good writing.
I actually never thought of it like that, but that just makes too much sense.
Yeah.
There's also, because I grew up reading a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Oh, yes.
And I think a lot of people who are not familiar with the books think that Sherlock Holmes is just like this next level genius and like no one could possibly understand how he thinks. But it's actually kind of the opposite. And like if you read Arthur Conan Doyle's writing, Sherlock Holmes explains his thought process in a very simple way, and to the point where once you read his explanations, you think, oh wow, it all makes too much sense. And you as the reader feel like, wow, I feel so smart now that I've gotten that piece of knowledge.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, and then the instinct of that isn't like, Sherlock Holmes isn't showing off, or I guess Conan Doyle isn't doing that to show off how smart he is, but he's doing that to, write good fiction.
Yeah. So it works for both fictional writing and non-fictional writing, I think. Yeah, it is putting the focus on the reader. I think that's the key.
Yeah, and with the documents I need to write at work, a lot of legal documents, there's a lot of archaisms, and that's just because this is a version of a document that got updated from a version of a document that got updated from a version of a document that's actually quite old. And so you kind of have these weird anachronisms in the text, and they're just unhelpful for people trying to understand what it actually says. I think there's a big push towards, I think lawyers have a reputation for being verbose and using big complicated words and throwing in Latin terms when you really don't need Latin terms. But there's been a big push recently to do everything in plain language. And I really like it. It's been a bit of a shake-up, but there are a lot of the times, it's much easier to understand, and that's what you need a legal document to be.
Has there been any pushback in this new movement? Because it sounds like a great idea to me.
I think it's generally accepted, but I think often you can use, like, there are often a lot of technical terms that have a very specific meaning, and that's helpful for writing something with a very specific meaning. But it's very hard to understand unless you have the context, or you need a lawyer to explain what the document says when it's realistic. Oh, it's like if it's a big contract, it's you agreeing with somebody else. But it's often drafted by lawyers. And so you, as a person signing the contract, need to know and understand what it said. So, you shouldn't need someone else to explain what you're agreeing to. But, sometimes, like, technical language is useful. But, I think people get around it just by having a definition, or sometimes you just have a page of definitions. And that's kind of how we get around it.
Gonna say that I don't think that jargon is inherently bad, and there are ways to mitigate misunderstandings or like lack of clarity with things like a glossary or a dictionary built into the document of some sort. I think like quite oftentimes you just kind of need jargon to simplify things, and like the layperson doesn't really need to understand this particular thing because like it's not particularly relevant to their decision making maybe. But there are some things like what you mentioned, is that some of the lack of clarity in legal documents is a result of updating an old document that has been updated from an old document. And as you know, language just kind of changes over time, so certain words might not have the same meaning 50 years down the line.
Yeah.
A real extreme case of this is I think the word nature.
Oh, really?
So the word nature, that as we know it today, you probably think of like the outdoors, the environment, trees and hills and that kind of thing. But I think nature in its original form would derive from whatever the Latin word was for nature. It actually just kind of meant the cycle of continuance, just things happening as they should if you just kind of leave it alone.
Oh, interesting.
So that's one example. I can't think of a more modern example.
Yeah, I know a couple. So I know nice.
Oh.
It used to mean dumb. Like someone
What?
stupid. Yeah, a nice person is just a bit of a dumb person.
I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, and vile.
Okay, hang on. Okay, vile means evil. What could vile possibly have originally meant? I'm going to guess smelly?
No, it means like low class or poor.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That is diabolical.
Yeah, it's a big change. And so, I was listening to, I think it was some famous speech that Shakespeare wrote. And, I think it's Henry V says, he's rallying up his troops to fight the French. And he says, "He who fights with me today will be my brother, be he ever so vile." And you're like, what, you're making friends with evil people? But no, he's just saying, like the low class people will be friends with the king if they fight with him today, which is a pretty epic thing to say.
Yeah, but
it's just not really what you think that it means as a modern reader.
yeah. So bringing back to the legal documents, how do you think that we would deal with that? So let's say we do a grand modernizing of all legal documents today. Let's just say we could just snap our fingers and let it happen. A decade or two from now, some of those words may change meaning, and some of them could change quite drastically. Is there anyone addressing that kind of potential issue?
I think we couldn't just snap our fingers and update all the documents, and so I think it can be a bit difficult to imagine what that would do. I think regularly, organizations that often, that regularly issue legal documents like banks, they should regularly update their documents to have clearer language. And then, but I still see a lot of times where it says, whereas. And I think whereas is a word that we mean it's a conjunctive, like but or however. But it's sometimes used in legal definitions or legal documents to mean something like take notice or pay attention to. And it's not obvious to me. But, I think regularly, like, documents should be updated to use plain language.
Okay, so it just sounds like we kind of need I'm going to use the word paradigm shift again, like change our way of thinking to, again, be more audience focused and write any sort of new documentation or new legal documents that's going out. It should go out with the idea in mind that anyone can read this will have the most amount of clarity or understanding as possible.
Yes, although that raises another question of who are you actually writing to? Now, some people might say, if I'm drafting a document, if I'm drafting a will for someone to sign, then it's written for the person signing the will. But you could also argue you're writing to the court, being like, this may get disputed, and when it gets disputed, it's going to go and be read by a judge, and so you're writing it for the judge. And so you can kind of use sort of legal language then. But yes, people have different perspectives. But I think, if the judge would understand plain speech better than every lay people understanding legal speech. So I think it should go towards plain and simple everyday language.
Can it ever be a case? Because like when I think of the courtroom and legal things, Hollywood's kind of instilled into me that there's always like some sort of legal loophole because of wordings. Like, is that an actual fear that lawyers have when they're drafting up legal documentation? Is that the reason why they tend to use legal language to kind of cover all bases, or is it just coming from a place of like, I just want to sound smart?
Yeah, that's what I was saying before about technical language, is that, that can close a loophole, or you might want to use language to keep it consistent with some other document. Yeah, I think your perception from Hollywood is probably a bit less dramatic than it is in Hollywood, but yeah, that is a real fear that there's some loophole and we need to close it. But I think if you use plain language well and you use definitions, there should be a way around it. I know, unless someone has some example that I can't think of at the moment where that would be necessary. And the other thing we were thinking is not all communication is written language. Most of the time we're having a conversation like this, and I'm not being too careful about the words that I use when I'm speaking to you, Dan, because I kind of know that you'll understand what I mean, and if you don't know what I mean, you'll ask me.
That sounds reasonable, yeah.
And I think that's a quality of spoken language. When you're writing something, you often have one shot to get everything right. Right.
Well, when we're speaking though, we don't repeat ourselves too much. How do we have clarity? Like, let's suppose like someone's giving a speech. Yeah. It's still kind of the same concept as written language in that you have to say everything once and hope that everyone understood the message.
Yes, but when you're giving a speech, you've got more levers to pull. So if someone's giving a speech, they're not just, a very bad speech would just be reading out the text. But when someone's giving a speech, they're using a lot of non-verbal language too. So they might be using body language, they might be using pauses, they might, say something and then there's some silence, or they might pick up that the audience is confused and then they might change what they say. They could improvise a bit. There's a lot of our speech is not the words that we use.
Right. You're saying that non-verbal communication conveys a lot more meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. You're always saying a little bit more than what you're saying, because you're also giving how you say it is important information for your audience to understand.
Is this like do you think this is reactionary? Like, I said something and it looks like I'm just getting a bunch of dead fish eyes. I don't think they understood what I'm saying, so I'm going to spend a bit more time explaining that. Or like, what is it about nonverbal communication that helps with our understanding?
I think you're giving a lot more information in how you say something than just what you say. So there's a classic sentence. I didn't say she stole my money. And if you put the emphasis on a different word, the sentence changes meaning. So I didn't say she stole my money. I didn't say she stole my money. I didn't say she stole my money. Well, all those sentences have slightly different meanings.
Yeah, that's a classic one. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't consider those kind of little nuances in their speeches. And like you mentioned, that a bad speech is one where they're just kind of reading off a script.
Yeah.
And I've seen way too much of that in my uni days. And I thought once I became a working professional, I would stop seeing that. But I was kind of shocked that I've seen some even very... Oh, well, actually, people who tend to keep doing that don't tend to rise the ranks particularly high, I'll be honest. But yeah, it is shocking the number of presentations I've seen where people just kind of read off slides. It's rather disappointing. And it doesn't help me understand the content more. If they're just going to read things off, they might as well just send out an email and I can just read this myself. I don't know why you're wasting my time with this meeting.
Yeah, so what are some things you can do in a meeting that you can't do if they just emailed it? Like, well, what's... If they were instead going to give a really good presentation, how would that be different?
I think it is... Oh, hang on, let me think about that.
So instead of someone reading off the slides, they go and give this absolute stellar presentation. What's the difference in the outcome for you?
I guess some of the indicators for me, aside from... I guess the main thing for me is with the way that people talk, you can, as you said, you can emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things. Right? So if I start talking about... Okay, let's say I'm like doing a PowerPoint presentation and then page 5, there's something new concept that shows up and suddenly I get more animated and I get more passionate. Okay, as the listener, I know this is the thing that I need to be paying attention to.
Yeah.
And then like a bit later, like page 6, okay, this is less important, they're just giving details, so they speak a bit more monotonously and a bit more boring. And then later on, maybe they ask a question and then they have a long pause. That gets me thinking now. It's like, yeah, what did that person actually say and how does it impact me? It's a lot, like, they're not asking, they don't have to like ask things, they don't need to throw these things at the audience, but we're playing a little game of a reaction, kind of.
Yeah, there's emotion, there's engagement. I guess it's similar to what you're saying with painting that picture in your head. They can do that. They've got more colors or more paintbrushes when they're presenting well than if they're just writing.
Yeah, and the problem is it's a very different kind of tool. So I guess like if words are like putting paint on a canvas, maybe these non-verbal cues, they're more advanced things like trying to chip out a sculpture.
Like writing in 3D.
Writing in 3D. But I think the problem is it's often hard to teach people non-verbal communication, or it might be the case that non-verbal communication is simply not taught well. Which one do you think is more true?
I don't think it's taught, actually. I think people sort of pick it up as they're learning language.
Yeah, I think the only pieces of advice I was told when I was doing speeches in school was, oh, you need to stand straight, look at the audience. They make a big deal out of eye contact, which I think is a little bit overrated, but you know, whatever. I'm not saying that you should be looking down at a piece of paper, but I mean, my general advice for like looking at the audience is you can just look at the top of people's heads. I think that works perfectly fine.
Yeah, and eye contact, it can get really intense when you're speaking in front of people.
Yeah, could you just imagine if like some like CEO or lead just eyeing you down the whole speech?
I mean, I'd be paying attention.
Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, in hindsight, yeah, I don't think I've been taught a lot of these non-verbal communications. I just kind of picked them up naturally from seeing what works or doesn't work from other people's presentations.
Yeah, maybe we learn it. I don't know this, but I'm just speculating. But maybe we learn non-verbal communication when we're learning language as kids. Maybe it's all part of the same thing that we just pick up as toddlers. Who knows?
Well, I think there is truth in that, but you could also say the same thing about just verbal communication and speech, in that kids kind of pick up how to talk from hearing their parents talk, hearing their friends talk at school or whatnot, and that kind of develops their vocabulary as well. I think it is something that we all kind of grow and learn over time. So there's a natural component in that we kind of figure these things out by ourselves, but I still think there is a component where it could be taught. And I'm thinking that maybe verbal communication is often a conscious thought. So I'm thinking in my head which words I'm going to use to convey the ideas in my head, whereas non-verbal communication is pretty much completely unconscious. I don't really think about whether or not I'm smiling, whether or not I'm looking at someone in the eyes, or whatever it may be. Those are habits that I have to build beforehand, because I'm not going to really think about it while I'm doing the talk.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We use body language and facial expressions, and it's one of those things like you can catch people in lies because their body language is different to what they're saying, and or at least that's what I learned from watching TV. I think one is very conscious and one's very unconscious.
Yeah, I think because even from a receiving end, right, when we see someone giving a speech, the person who employs a lot of these like non-verbal techniques, they're often perceived as just like more confident or more reliable. There's something about them that just, it could be even the case that I don't even know what that person's saying, but like I just get the general vibe that this person is saying something important.
Yeah, I knew someone that would watch comedians in French, and you could. She said that it's still funny.
Oh.
Or like you know when to laugh, and even if you don't really understand it. I haven't tried that, but maybe our listeners could give that a go and let us know how it goes.
Yeah, that sounds like a very extreme version of that. Wow, that's interesting. I think a good example of how impactful nonverbal communication is the 1960s televised Nixon versus Kennedy presidential debate.
Right.
Do you know much about the history of that?
No, not really.
Well, so basically this was the first televised presidential debate in history. So it was quite a landmark event, and a lot of people in America tuned in. And the interesting thing is, when people were polled about the debate, the people who tuned into the debate via radio, which was the legacy way, the way most people used to listen to presidential debates, the vast majority of them said that Richard Nixon won the debate. He had the better policies, he made better points, and like the things that he said made more sense.
Right.
But funny enough, most people who watched the televised debate said that Kennedy won because Kennedy looked more confident. He wore a suit that had contrasting colors to the background, whereas Nixon kind of wore this weird color that kind of slightly blended into the background. Nixon was a little bit more hunched over, whereas Kennedy was standing straight. Kennedy had this like nice smile, whereas Nixon kind of had this like a bit of a frown going on. So it looks a little bit. He both looked a little bit angry. Oh, not angry, but just like less friendly but at the same time, he looked very tired because he'd been campaigning for a while, and he also apparently had a knee injury as well. So like he wasn't really standing fully straight. So there was a lot of these non-verbal cues that made people think this Nixon guy, something about him seems a bit shifty, like something. I can't quite put my finger to it, but he might be saying some right things, but I can't trust them.
Right, interesting. And my guess is that Kennedy had more experience of being on TV.
I'm not entirely sure about that, but I do know that his team put a big focus in the campaign. They put a lot of focus on how do we maximize his appeal for television.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
interesting.
like that suit choice. They probably trained him up and how to speak in front of a camera as well. Like they put a lot of emphasis onto that. And so the Kennedy team understood the importance of non-verbal communication.
Yeah, that's interesting because a lot of it's visual. And it's interesting that people made their decision not by listening, or not just by listening to the words that they were saying, but watching how they were saying it. And that's an interesting one.
Now the question is that necessarily a good thing? Because now I feel like politics has kind of gone to the extreme, and optics is 99% of the battle, rather than the actual policies that people make.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sad reality, is that people don't take politics that seriously anymore.
Well, they take it seriously, but not for what I would consider proper reasons.
Okay, but I mean, I don't think I know anyone that has, laid out all the policies, tried to make an optimal decision. I think most people, it either is an emotional decision, which is there's always going to be some kind of emotion in who you vote for, or they just, I don't know, I think some people do take politics very seriously, but I think most people, I guess I just have to pick one. Any, mini, money, mo, this one looks better. Or this one sounds better, or this one seems more appealing to me. I like this person more.
Well, maybe we'll hold off on some of the controversial for future episodes.
Oh, we're not going to hold off on controversial.
No, I mean, we can get into that, but I'm just thinking that maybe we can do another dedicated podcast about... another dedicated episode to some controversial ideas. Don't get me wrong, I have some very controversial political opinions that I want to get out there.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing those, Dan.
Yeah, stay tuned in, folks.
Actually, Dan, I have a very controversial question for you. Okay, Dan. What does it mean to be a real man?
A real man? Well, I feel like if you asked me that question when I was a child, the first thing that would come to mind is Arnold Schwarzenegger, ripped bodybuilder, just muscles on top of muscles. That's kind of the image I had as a child of what being manly was. But today, when I see a big muscle-bound man in a group of people, I wouldn't naturally assume that person is the leader of the group.
So being a man is being the leader?
It's one of the qualities of being a man. So yeah, what I would say a man is in my head is someone who leads, someone who guides, and someone who protects and provides. So if you have those qualities, that kind of builds up this image of being manly.
Right. So for those of us who, not really leading or protecting or providing, I'm just a guy who sort of wakes up in the morning, has a coffee, goes to work, comes home, does some stuff, and then goes to bed. Am I a real man?
I mean, of those qualities, you are ticking off, technically providence. So you're providing for yourself financially. You're not being reliant on others. And you're also providing for society, because if you're getting paid for to do something, you probably are doing something that's beneficial for society. In most cases.
Yeah, I think our society sort of is really struggling to figure out what is a man. And I think it is actually pretty hard to put a little pin in being like, this person's a man and this person isn't a man. If we're taking that. Yeah, even if we're taking that kind of framework, being like, is this person like leading and protecting? But I think there are a lot of, I think there is an element that is quite social, being like, sure, I don't know what it is to be, a good man, but I know what it would mean to be a good father, or to be a good son, or to be a good brother. And is there anything more manly than being a good mate?
A good mate is your definition of a good man.
Well, you relate. Being a man is, you have several roles that are all manly roles, like father, brother, son, friend. Those are all things you kind of have to do as a man. Just as a little bit of a tangent, there was this book that was very popular, particularly among conservatives a few years ago. It was called Wild at Heart, and essentially the idea is, men who are struggling to just go out into the wild, into nature, go conquer nature, then you come back as, a real man, and you'll be fine.
That sounds like it has elements of my childhood idea of a man, of like, just Arnold Schwarzenegger wrestling a bear kind of imagery.
Yeah, but it's not very, it's not very paternal. It's not very, it's, men are, like, it's, well, I think I was a bit brassed off because that's not my issue. Like, I don't think that solves my problems. And then there's also a thing about being a man is, well, what's not a man? You're like, well, I'm a man and not an animal. Like, I'm communicating and rational and, creating societies and that. And then think I'm a man and not a machine, and that's sort of in the realm of sci-fi, being like, it's these robots, are they people or not? And there's an element of being a man is something that isn't just, it's something that a robot can't be. It's like connecting and feeling.
Interesting, because I don't think I've ever seen a robot in a film and thought, wow, that's such a manly robot.
Yeah.
So it seems like what you're getting is that there's a connection element there to be qualified as a man. And to clarify, when we say man, are we making a distinction? Is the thing that we're calling a man like the differentiator between a man and a boy, or is a man just a standalone thing that exists in society?
Yeah, when you hear be a man, what are you hearing not being?
I'm going to hear, in my mind, I'm just hearing don't be a boy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I hear that too. When I hear be a man, I hear grow up.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, the next point is I'm a man, so I'm not an animal, I'm not a machine. And he goes, and I'm be a man, not a woman. And I think that's where stuff gets controversial.
So in a group of women, in a group of ladies, there can't be a designated man or someone takes the male, not male, someone who takes the man role in that group. That's not a possibility.
No.
Okay, why not exactly?
Well, I think we'll have to go back to this lecture I was in. So I was doing a geography paper because I didn't study geography, but for some reason they just let anyone take geography papers.
Yeah, there's no barrier to
There's
entry.
no prerequisite. You can just jump straight in, which was not a great idea. But I was in a lecture. I don't know how this related to geography, but they were trying to teach us postmodern gender theory, and they were trying to argue that masculinity is a social construct, so it's just something that exists because we've kind of our culture has kind of evolved in a way where there is this thing called masculinity, and then people embody that to different degrees. And, they'd looked at different cultures being, in Anglo-Western culture, when we think of masculine, we think of Arnold Schwarzenegger. But in a Hispanic culture or in a different culture, you might, in a Western culture, we think of masculine as being quite stoic and emotionless, but that's not something that's true in Hispanic culture. And, saying, oh, look, what it meant to look masculine has changed. It used to, at different times, masculinity has involved lots of facial hair. At different times, masculinity has been completely clean shaven. And, they're trying to say, oh, it's all social. But I think there's a big leap between being like, yeah, there's some degree of what we consider masculinity as part of our culture, and masculinity is completely arbitrary.
Yeah, I think as I said, there are superficial elements to what we consider to be manly, but I think some of it is grounded and pointing towards a reality of what masculinity is. Like, for example, as I told you, the person who's very muscle bound, that doesn't, I don't think, inherently make that person manly, but what those muscles allows that person to do is to protect a family, let's say, from a bear attack. It's an enabler rather than the actual thing that. So even if you are a very muscular person, if you're a coward and you run away from a fight and you leave your village to be undefended because of that, that's inherently unmanly. That's how I would frame it.
I'm interested in why when we're talking about a man, you started thinking about villages and bears, and those kind of images were.
That's a good question. I don't know. I've got this caveman kind of Tarzan imagery in my head.
Yeah.
I can't say why my brain's gone to there.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting is that we often have this origin story around, we have this origin story in our head, things in our culture came from a Neolithic age when we were cavemen. But that might not be true. If we have I think if we can't try and disconnect our view of gender roles from evolution, we might get a different answer.
So to understand, what is your answer to what it means to be a man?
I think that there's very much a social element of, but you can't be it's not about looking and being like Tarzan. If anything, I think Tarzan wasn't manly. He was a lot like an animal.
True, yeah.
So I think there's a relational. So you're relating to someone as a man. We often talk about man to man. I think that's part of it, and I think it's leaning into. Yeah, I think it's relational, and then I think it's comparative. Not machines, not animals. And then also the not woman thing is a thing that gets controversial because, women and men share a lot of things. Well, what exactly is a different thing? And I think it just has to come down to maybe, there are social elements of being a woman. You don't have a man-to-man conversation with a woman. It would just be it's not the same.
Sure.
And I think there's a biological element to that. But probably I can't come down to a singular definition. But I do think it is a pretty profound thing to be a man.
Okay.
And I think we should just embrace that. We have some kind of idea.
Yeah, so what I'm getting from the way you view masculinity, it is some sort of social relationship that exists and different cultures, different lenses will see that played out in a different way, but it's all grounded in this universal idea that being a man means something. It's not just an arbitrary thing, but it has a role that just plays out differently in different cultures, and that gives it meaning.
Yes, and I would also include a biological element to that. I think with all the postmodern nonsense that I was taught, I think a lot of it was extremely sexualized, but I don't think that's all of it. You know, most of the time I'm just being a friend or a brother or a son, or perhaps my other take on this is, what do you think is the word that's most associated with masculine? Or masculinity? What word do you hear tied to it a lot?
Strong?
Yeah. Well, I hear a lot of toxic masculinity.
Oh, yeah, that's thrown around a lot lately.
And I think what they describe as sort of toxic masculinity, I don't think that's masculine. Or...
because it's often like a very selfish idea of masculinity. Okay, I want to be a man in the sense that I'm financially independent and I get women.
Or, dominance.
Dominance, yeah. So it's not really a very, how would you say, like a respectful social contract that exists, but it's one where I'm getting all the benefits.
Yeah, it's not relational. Do you think a toxic man, or what we consider to be a toxic man, would be a good father, or a good son, or a good friend, or a good husband? You know, I think there's a lot more to being a man than that. And rather than putting a definition to it, I think we can embrace there's a sort of some kind of profound aspect to it. Or some kind of aspect to it that we can't truly put our finger on. But I don't think masculinity is toxic. I think masculinity is super wholesome.
And you think it's like an overall benefit to society?
Absolutely.
Right.
Where would we be without men?
I feel like that's already a controversial statement. So we've kind of covered the relational, there are aspects of being a man, there are responsibilities and roles that you have in man. You mentioned like being a father, son, a good friend. We've kind of talked about how toxic masculinity doesn't fit into those things. Here's another group of people. What about the type of people who just do the bare minimum? Maybe they go to work, or maybe they're unemployed, I don't know. And then they just like sit around, watch TV, and just
drink Mountain Dew and play computer games.
Yeah, and just laze away and just live a comfortable life. They're not necessarily bad friends. In fact, they might even have good friends that they play D&D with. But they're not really...
Yeah, they don't look like George Clooney. They're not Indiana Jones.
Yeah, so are those types of people like manly, do you think?
I think there's a responsibility. Like I think with that one you wouldn't think, are they being adults? Are they acting like... are they looking after themselves? I think there is an element of you looking after them. That's part of that wholesome masculinity. But yeah, playing D&D is not unmanly.
Oh yeah, I'm not trying to say, I wasn't thinking shots at or anything like that.
Yeah, I play D&D.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not me. I do unmanly things too.
I think any hobby can be manly if you just, you know what you enjoy and like you're just confident that you like it. Yeah. If you're a very confident man and you take up crochet and you just say, yeah, I do it, it's fun, like, relaxes me. Like, who am I to like call that unmanly?
Yeah, and so I think often it's not what we often think is manly or unmanly. You know, there's when it comes to all these things that we've talked about, knitting or crochet is sort of, although it's often associated with women, there's no real reason for that.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that's often kind of considered unmanly is like cooking. Like, it's often considered a woman cook, but like the restaurant industry is chefs in the restaurant industry are largely male dominated.
I've never looked at Gordon Ramsay and thought, yeah, he's a bit feminine.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, that person deals with knives and fire and like it's a dangerous field.
Yeah. But we've gone back to masculinity involves danger.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that again that just goes back to the cultural lens that in the Anglo Western worldview that we have. Again, I've said at the start of this that my view of a man is someone who, well, what's my definition again?
Protects, leads, provides.
Yeah, something like that. So
yeah, and I think that's all. I think those aren't untrue, but yeah, I think if I say go be a man to somebody, I'm telling you to do something really good. No, I'm not telling you exactly what is like specifically what it is, but
I just have the old Disney Mulan song, "Be a Man."
Yeah, it's just an interesting comment on masculinity, where she's a woman trying to be a soldier, and she's just not physically. She eventually, through determination, becomes physically strong enough that people think she's a man.
Oh no, the way that she kind of...
Or am I completely misremembering that movie?
Yeah, no, the way that she kind of gained the respect of her teammates was... So there was a climbing challenge.
Oh, yeah.
That was basically impossible. You had to climb up this totem pole or something, get to the top, but you have to do it while being weighed down by these giant, metal, medallion things, or these heavy weights. And obviously that makes it very hard to do. Climbing up the totem pole is hard enough, but you're doing it with these giant weights makes it harder. But what she did, she used her wit to tie the bells together and use it as a support to help her climb up.
Right, interesting. So she's being clever rather than strong. I think I'm entering the zone of overthinking this, which is often what we do on these podcasts. Something I would like to end with was a quote from one of the most manly people I think has ever lived.
Who's that?
Marcus Aurelius.
Okay,
he was this Roman emperor dude, and he wrote this real famous book, and it's just it's basically just his journal that he's writing notes to himself. It's just his thoughts about life as a Roman emperor, and it's truly, truly fascinating. I would highly recommend. But one of the things he says is, stop wondering about what it is to be a good man and just go out and be one. And I think there is some real truth to that.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's actually kind of true with a lot of things in life. Like people who are have a certain quality, whether that be let's say confidence, for example. People who are confident don't wake up every day thinking, how can I be confident today? They just kind of just are.
Yeah.
And yes, you can take pointers about how to become more confident, how to become more manly. But 80% of being a man is just being one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that, I think we'll wrap up today's episode. Thank you for listening to Chats at Arcadia. If you've enjoyed the episode, hit subscribe and leave a comment for any topics you want us to cover in the future. Until next time, see you later.
Bye.